Thank you so much for inviting me to the conference and also for the very nice introduction. So, as we know, East Asian fertility rates have sunk to very low levels, what demographers call lowest low fertility, 1.3 TFR, total fertility rates, or lower. And East Asia has become a very important region of the world to study. So when I started studying low fertility, I was mainly reading the European demographic literature. American demographers write very little about low fertility because we don't quite have it yet, although it seems to be coming in the US. Southern Europe and Eastern Europe have shown very low fertility rates, and now even Nordic countries are having declining fertility rates. But in any case, East Asia is really quite remarkable. And I was thinking, as Min Jo was talking about migration and the other speakers on the first panel talking about migration, fertility is different because we haven't seen this before in human history. So it's a really, really unusual phenomenon to have so many populations in the post-industrial world showing fertility rates that are this low. And it's also notable that governments in East Asia, for instance, Japan and South Korea, are spending very large amounts of money, government resources, to try to raise the birth rate. And basically nothing is working so far. So I'm going to talk about some of these things. So the drop to very, very, very low fertility in East Asia can largely be attributed to two phenomena. Rapid increase in the proportion of men and women who remain unmarried. And again, we can look at Japan and South Korea. Upwards of 30% or so of men aged 45 to 49 are never married in these two societies. So these are also extraordinary percentages. Percentage unmarried or never married for women is a little bit lower. But when I first started studying Japan many decades ago, I never would have believed that this would happen because marriage was really nearly universal. And of course, in the context of East Asia, non-marriage generally means no children because the birth rate, the number of births outside of marriage, outside the marital context, is very, very low throughout East Asia, distinguishing East Asia from many parts of Europe. And the second contributing factor, of course, is the decline in marital fertility. And it has to do with the drop, really, to a rapid increase, rather, in the number of couples who have only one child. So there are a lot of big questions to be asked, and I think most of these are indeed to be asked in the future, and I'm certainly not going to answer them here, but I wanted to raise them as important comparative questions. So I think there's a great deal to study in terms of the similarities and differences in the causes of very low fertility across East Asia, and of course between East Asia and the post-industrial West. And within countries, I think we're getting gradually a better understanding of the reasons for rising rates of singlehood and the reasons for the drop in marital fertility. But I think it's very interesting to think about how much overlap there is in the reasons for these two phenomena. And then, of course, as sociologists and demographers, we're always concerned with the socioeconomic gradient. And again, this would be both for rising rates of singlehood and for the decline in marital fertility. And the answers to these questions obviously will have very big implications for theories of fertility decline, which were all developed based on Western experience, and for the design of policies. Although I'll have a few words, if there's time, at the end of the presentation to say how government policymakers interpret the data. I can put it that way. In the case of Japan. So Japan was the first country in East Asia to exhibit falling fertility, and it goes way back to the 1970s. And if you compare it to European countries, Italy was the first, and Italy began its fertility decline also in the 1970s. And really the birth rate in Japan has stabilized at around 1.3. Now, it's very clear that Japan is facing a huge demographic challenge, and again, it's the first one in East Asia to be facing this challenge because the fertility decline started so long ago and has been so consistent. So Japan is the most rapidly aging population, with nearly 30% of the population over age 65 already. And the government makes population projections every year, and they really haven't changed for the last 10 or 15 years. And the population has now reached a point where it's declining in absolute numbers. Japan has the lowest ratio of working age adults to adults over 65 years old. And of course, the demographic situation has been coupled with several economic challenges in the past 20 to 30 years, although the recent news from the Japanese economy has been much more promising. That's very recent. But Japan has exhibited very slow economic growth since the recession that began in the early 90s, very low productivity, comparatively speaking, especially with Western nations, an enormous national debt that makes the American national debt look not so bad, actually, and labor shortages that have already developed and are likely to get worse. And on the subject of migration and immigration, there's very little discussion of immigration in Japan, even now. Although there are new programs that emerge to bring more highly skilled and unskilled workers into the economy, at least for short periods of time. So this is the population pyramid of Japan. And you can see it rapidly approaches what we could call a mummy shape. And I used to say that in my talks, and then I would feel very badly about calling it a mummy. And then I realized that a number of Japanese labor economists also call it a mummy. So again, this has been the persistent projection for a number of years because the birth rate is not budging. So at the beginning of the Japanese Diet's session, the congressional session in January of last year, Prime Minister Kishida said the following: "Our nation is on the cusp of whether it can maintain its societal functions." It's not quite clear what that means, but it's vague in Japanese as well. "It is now or never when it comes to policies regarding births and child rearing. It is an issue that simply cannot wait any longer." Now, this has been said before, but I think Prime Minister Kishida said it the most forcefully. So I published a book a year and a half ago in Japanese that deals with the low birth rate and also persistent gender inequality in the labor market and in the family in Japan. And what I did was to put Japan in comparative perspective with other post-industrial countries, especially in the West. And I focused particularly on the role of social norms, gender role norms, especially, social policies, and how norms and policies interact with each other. So this presentation is going to be an outlier, I think, in this conference because I'm mostly going to talk about qualitative data. In the book, I made a lot of macro-level comparisons of quantitative data across OECD countries, which one can do with East Asia only for Japan and Korea. So it's rather inconvenient for the rest to study the rest of East Asia, but in any case, Japan and South Korea are included in the OECD. So I made many macro-level comparisons of working hours and a lot of indicators, gender inequality indicators and so forth. And then the meat of the book draws on structured, in-depth interviews with young adults in their late 20s and early 30s, men and women, in 5 countries. So this was a huge project I designed over a decade ago, actually. And I chose 3 countries with very low birth rates, Spain, South Korea, and Japan, and 2 with more moderate birth rates, the US and Sweden. And we asked questions about typical weekday, about working conditions, gender role attitudes, aspirations about marriage and children, and viewpoints on the country's family policies, especially in the case of Japan and South Korea. Very detailed questions. And this was really to get at the texture of everyday life and how social norms are affecting people's attitudes and behaviors. So really to try to study a lot of things that are much more difficult to study, with quantitative survey data. And the 2 countries that I compare to Japan in the book are Sweden and the US. And there's an empirical reason and a theoretical reason. And I guess there's an additional reason, which is in Japan, people want to read about Sweden as kind of the classic case, so-called case of gender equality and moderate birth rates, and people are always interested in what's going on in the United States as well, and don't really have, a clear picture again of everyday life and so forth. So the theoretical reason that I chose Sweden and the US is that Sweden has a combination of social norms and social policies that support a dual earner, dual carer family model. And Sweden has a great advantage in that it started this project a long time ago. And of course, built into the project of trying to raise the birth rate was gender equality, a purposeful focus on gender equality, and a focus on incorporating women into the economy. That was the initial thrust of Swedish policies many decades ago. The US, I would characterize as having social norms that more and more support dual earner, dual carer families, that kind of family model, but we have almost no social policies to support that model. So we have, of course, no federally guaranteed paid maternity and childcare leave, no high quality, maybe not no high quality affordable childcare, but very little. And very little that is subsidized by the government. So we don't have the institutions and the structures really to provide good support for dual earner families. But our norms have evolved quite significantly, I think, to support dual earner families. Japan is a different case, of course. I'll argue that the social policies are there, but are very weak in terms of supporting a dual earner, dual carer model. So I'm going to talk a lot about the social policies that the government has created. And the social norms to support a dual earner, dual carer model are even weaker, even though in Japan for a significant period of time, dual earner households have outnumbered male breadwinner housewife households. So the empirical reason to look at Sweden and the US is what I'll show you next. And this is cohort fertility rates. So if we go back to the 1950s, women born in 1950, 51, and so forth, these 3 countries had the same fertility rate, around 2 replacement level fertility. And I actually didn't know that before I chose Sweden and the US as comparison cases for the qualitative data. But when I looked into it, I saw, well, they they had the same starting point in terms of cohort fertility rates for women who finished their reproductive life cycle around 1995 or so. So born in 1950. And then you see that Japan just falls off the map continuously. Now, again, since these are cohort fertility rates, they look unusually high because we know that the TFR for Sweden and the US is considerably below this. But in any case, this is what the cohort fertility looks like. And this is the composition. So you can see the huge effect that non-marriage and childlessness has had on Japanese fertility. Again, most of this 28% or whatever childlessness is due to non-marriage. And proportion of women born in various years, again, cohorts who had two children, that's been absolutely normative in Sweden, high in the US, and it's gone down in Japan. And then even more so with 3 children. Very, very few people have more than 2 children in Japan now. Now, I'm going to focus mainly in this talk on marital fertility because that's where the government policies have principally been focused, and because I'm interested in gender relations within couples. So, what have been the goals of recent Japanese government policies? Well, the first goal, which was established probably in 2014 or so under former Prime Minister Abe, was to raise the labor force participation rate of married women, especially mothers, in order to start addressing the current labor shortages. And, the typical labor force profile for women over the life cycle in Japan and also Korea was a very distinct M-shaped curve. And that has now been eliminated. So the proportions of women who leave the labor force upon marriage or upon first birth and only come back into the labor force, say 10 or 15 years later, those proportions have gone way, way down, as I'll show you in a moment. Former Prime Minister Abe aimed to create an environment in which women find it comfortable to work, or in other words, an environment where women will shine. That was his phrase, which a lot of Japanese women didn't like very well, very much. But the principal focus up until now on supporting married mothers has been on married mothers who are in so-called regular jobs, what we used to call permanent jobs, rather than non-regular jobs or precarious jobs. Now the government just very recently is realizing that they've got to address maternity and childcare leave policy for precarious workers, because the majority of Japanese women, in fact, are in precarious jobs, even though there are many, many more women who are in regular jobs than used to be the case. But precarity is still a very big issue in the Japanese economy. And then the second goal, of course, of the government has been to actively try to increase the country's birth rate, especially marital fertility, as I said, in order to forestall future labor shortages. So nowhere in these policy goals is gender equity or gender equality purpose, but rather increasing women's participation in the economy. And that goal has been quite well achieved, I would say. So the Japanese government has been very proud in the last several years to report that the proportion of employed mothers in Japan is higher than in the US now. So that's been great, basically a success. So here you can see the dramatic change. If we go back to the first 5 years of the 21st century, only 40% of Japanese women continued working after. Now, they took maternity leave and came back in, but they only 40% continued working after the birth of their first child. And this has gone way up to 70%. This is a very, very dramatic change. And also, it's notable that young Japanese men more and more are saying that they would like to have a wife who works rather than a wife who's a full-time housewife. So the light blue bar is the full-time housewife, and you can see back in the early 1990s, the highest percentage of Japanese men wanted to marry a woman who would have children and stay home and take care of the household. And that has gone way, way down. And this, obviously is evidence of the necessity that many people feel to have two earners in the household. So it's widely accepted now that married women work. That doesn't mean they necessarily work full-time. They may be working part-time. So the first policy goal, we can say, was really successfully achieved. The second one, not at all. The birth rate hasn't been affected at all by the policies. Now, European demographers argue that countries that have made it possible for women to combine paid employment and child rearing have not suffered large declines in their birth rate. And again, it's clear that the Japanese government has done a great deal to help women combine paid work and motherhood. So some of the policies have been dramatic expansion of public child care spaces, although there are still shortages in some local parts of major cities such as Tokyo and Osaka. But there has been considerable expansion of public child care. And Japanese people have confidence in public child care. It's quite different than some of the other Asian cases. So everybody trusts public child care because the caregivers have to be, government certified and so forth. Generous maternity leave has existed for a long time in Japanese labor law. And child care leave policy is also very good, and many of the women that we interviewed for the project were able to extend their child care leave to 14 months, 16 months, 18 months. Now, it was often the case that they did that because they couldn't find a child care space, because there is a shortage of spaces for infants and toddlers. And again, pockets of Tokyo and Osaka and other major cities have too few child care spaces. But in any case, child care leave policy is quite generous, and employers generally grant extensions to women who ask for them. And then there have been other accommodations that have been made, such as jitan, which is the short work hour option. So many women that we interviewed had taken this option, which means that they can go to work around 9 o'clock. The workday starts a little bit late in Japan, but so they can go to work maybe around 9 o'clock and they can leave at 4:30, guaranteed. And women like this because they can go and pick up their one small child, maybe two small children, from daycare, and go grocery shopping and go home and make the kids dinner and make their own dinner. So it works. It doesn't do anything to budge gender inequality, because it, of course, reinforces the fact that women's primary role is in the home and not in the workplace. And also there's a provision that people can sign up for in large companies to not be transferred to other parts of the country or even out of the country, because traditionally large Japanese companies told employees that they were going to be transferred. And there have been legal cases brought by men who wanted to go home and talk to their wife that evening, that they were told that they needed to be transferred to Hokkaido for 2 years or 3 years, and the boss said, no, you can't do that, you're going. So very, very family unfriendly human resource management and policies. And again, women now can turn down those transfers. Men are trying to be able to turn them down. So anyway, what's the problem? All these adjustments have been made, right, for working women, working mothers. Yeah, they're all for working mothers. That's the problem, I argue. So what hasn't been addressed is the fundamentally family-unfriendly conditions of work, such as long work hours for, again, regular, so-called, we used to call them permanent full-time male employees. And without changing, the workplace policies haven't promoted change in social norms that prescribe men's primary role as breadwinner and women's primary role as being in the home. So I would call Japan at this point a dual earner, single carer model, because many women, the majority of wives, have two jobs, one in the labor market, either full-time or part-time, and one at home. And I'll show you what the role at home looks like in a moment. So I argue that these fundamentally family-unfriendly working conditions and social norms, that men should be working very hard as the breadwinner and staying as late at the company in the evening as their manager wants them to, has contributed to the proportion of couples who have only one child, because it's simply very, very difficult to manage having more than one child if both people are working and if men are working under the conditions that many of them are working under. And I should say that one of my motivations in writing the book was to address Japanese men, because there are lots and lots of books on the difficult circumstances of Japanese women. And in fact, one Japanese publisher said, "We don't need any more books on gender inequality. We have enough." But I didn't want to write that kind of book on gender inequality anyway. I really wanted to have a chance to talk about men, and that's why we interviewed men and wives about their husbands, because many Japanese men are not very happy with the conditions under which they're living, and that can get ignored if we focus only on the huge gender wage gap and so forth. So I really addressed men in the book. As well. And a lot of men have read the book, which makes me very happy. If there's time, I can say a few words about reactions to the book. And the government also has not substantially been able to improve. It does not try terribly hard, I would say, to improve the economic situation of young adults, especially young men. And again, with the male breadwinner ideology still fairly strong in Japan, young men in precarious employment simply don't get married. Women don't want to marry them, and many men feel that they don't really have the right to get married. And this is the case in male breadwinner societies. So this partly explains the very large percentage of single young adults, singles in their 30s and 40s, most of whom will most likely never marry. So, as I said, I'm going to focus mainly on marital fertility. But I will say this kind of situation of precarity is similar to Southern Europe, which has what we call Alicia Etzera at Princeton calls insider-outsider labor markets, segmented labor markets. So Spain, for instance. So you get in on the ground level after you graduate from whatever education institution you've gone to, and then you stay in. But if you don't get in at the beginning, you're not going to get in later on, most likely. It's very hard to change to a much better job. So because Japanese workplace conditions and social policies that were based on a male breadwinner model have changed, but now, I argue, largely support a dual earner, single carer model of the family, they reproduce social norms about distinct roles, gender roles for men and women. So I argue that the workplace structure and social norms prescribing gender roles reinforce each other, and it makes change difficult. So there need to be shocks to the system, which also, it's useful to be a foreigner from Harvard or Princeton or Columbia or whatever, because they're external pressure, many people feel external pressure has some chance of promoting some change. So, in any case. So, as I said, many married women essentially have two jobs, one paid job and the unpaid job of housework and childcare. And of course, there's no hired-in housework. There's not that. There was that tradition many decades ago in Japan. It vanished, and people do not hire. Almost no one hires help for housework. So the wife does it all. And there's also a vicious cycle between this idea that men ultimately are the breadwinners, and they have to put up with the work conditions that they're in. Because they are primarily responsible for the income of the household. So it's difficult for men to fight intolerable working conditions. And also, there remains quite low interfirm mobility in the Japanese labor market. So it's difficult to change to a better job. So common conditions for Japanese regular employees, especially in large firms, are long work hours. I've mentioned already employees being subject to job transfers without being consulted. And traditionally, in the last 30, 40 years in Japan, there's been a real centralization of decisions about job responsibilities, job rotation, transfers, and other personnel matters. So it's very difficult for individuals to negotiate, as they probably would in the US, with their boss, because the decisions are made much more centrally and without regard to employees' personal or family circumstances or preferences, or even their preferences for the type of skills they'd like to develop. Also, men generally face intense stigma if they take parental leave, and I do think I'll have time to give you a little bit of a flavor of the qualitative data. So percentage of employees working long hours. For academics, this is kind of funny because we don't necessarily think 50 hours is a long work week, but the OECD does, so that's the definition. So you see Japan and Korea as the absolute outliers on this. And I've talked about this, highly gendered division of unpaid labor. This is what the ratio of women's to men's unpaid labor looks like. So Japanese women do 5 times as much unpaid work as Japanese men, and Korea is pretty close. And we know that nowhere in the world is there, complete gender equality in childcare and housework, but we also know that in Northern Europe it's fairly close, and in the United States men have been doing more and more childcare in particular. But it's very, very skewed in Japan, and every source of data I've looked at says the same thing. It's 5 times, women do 5 times as much unpaid work as Japanese men. Now, this next graph is not original to me. I put it together, but I put it together after reading an article by 2 labor economists that looked at this association. So if we look at the total fertility rate of countries on the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal axis, women's versus men's time spent in unpaid work, we can see that there's a strong negative relationship. And there you see Korea and Japan, again, as the outliers. So lower birth rates are occurring in countries where women have 2 jobs, at the home, and of course this is aggregate, but in any case, there is a relationship with strong relationship with the percentage of housework and childcare that women do. So, general suggestions for policy. Another motivation, again, that I had in writing the book was to make policy suggestions. And I argue in the book that workplace policies now need to turn to men and focus more on male employees, bringing working conditions and norms more into line with what's been developed for working mothers. And this would allow men to have more time for family. Now, of course, we need to think about the preferences of men, but younger men, by and large, are saying they don't want to lead the lives that their fathers did, and where they weren't at home very much, and they would like to be more active fathers. But if the companies, again, don't go along with that, it's extremely difficult for them to accomplish that. And there have been significant attempts at workplace reforms in Japan in the last several years, but it's very tough because many employers still try to measure or implicitly measure productivity by the number of hours of face time, which is not an accurate way of measuring productivity. But and then again, economic policies should primarily be targeting young adult workers in non-regular jobs to make them feel that they have enough economic support and income to get married and have children. Kodomo teate is child payments. And I cannot recommend them, although the government is going to try them again. Anyway, the Japanese government announced several months ago that they're going to have child payments that are not means tested, so everybody will get the same amount of money. Now, in our data, qualitative data, when we asked people about receiving, extra monthly payment for every child they had, people said, yeah, it's great. We bought a new refrigerator last month. It doesn't make you want to have another child, but it's a popular thing to do. And I've realized that in Japan, as elsewhere, empirically based policy recommendations may or may not be accepted by the government. That some of mine are close to being accepted, and this is one of them. To break the social norm that men should not take parental leave, I argued that it should be mandatory for new fathers to take 6 weeks of leave at full pay, so that there's no income reason, to claim that they can't take leave. And a number of large Japanese companies are instituting this now and are claiming that 100% of new fathers take leave. And then for equity reasons, I argued that mothers should be guaranteed 100% of their salary during maternity leave, which is more or less mandatory. And then, as I said earlier, make work hour flexibility, the short work hour option, and other currently mother-centric workplace policies gender neutral. Now, this is a huge aim, but I think it would go a long ways towards making men's work lives more tolerable, giving people more time for family life, and possibly raising the birth rate, because men would then also be carers at home. So I'll give just one example of how social norms have inhibited the effectiveness of policy. As I said, Japan has a very generous maternity and child care leave policy for women. And it also has one of the most generous child care leave policies for fathers among all middle and high income countries. Among Japanese working women, the non-precarious jobs, who qualify to take child care leave, about 80% do so. But only about 15% of Japanese fathers take child care leave. And actually, it's gone up from about 7% in the last 2 or 3 years. So it's gone up significantly, but it's still very low. And our qualitative data, I'll end on this note, address why men don't take child care leave. And three of the reasons that men gave us and that women gave us for not favoring men's childcare leave were that men's careers would be disrupted and damaged if they took leave because their bosses would penalize them, give them lower responsibilities, stall their wage increases and so forth. And then strong influence of social norms. Men said, well, nobody around me has taken leave, so I can't do it. So again, making it mandatory, everybody does it, gotta do it. Okay, solve that problem. Of course, the cost is another issue. So the government contributes to leave payments and companies contribute as well. And then it will cause trouble for colleagues. And this is a management issue because many people said, if I take leave, all the people on my team will have to pick up the slack. And then when I come back to work, people are really angry and resentful. Okay, so, this is a management issue. And actually a lot of companies now are asking me to tell them what to do. And I'm not an organizational specialist, but we're really in the weeds here about with policies that exist and are not used. And this is where a lot of the action, I think, is in order for people's lives to change. And then the income reason, we can wipe that out if we have 100% wage reimbursements. Okay, I've run out of time. How typical is Japan in East Asia? Well, Japan ranks lowest on gender equality among post-industrial countries and within East Asia. So the gender issues, the strong gender norms are very, very relevant. And unfortunately, we know that the path to low fertility for any country is a little distinct from other countries. So it's not really, I don't think, feasible to come up with one common set of policies to address the common reasons. Because, for instance, in Japan, people don't mention the cost of housing. In Korea, it's the first thing they mention. So women's share of unpaid household labor is a very common factor, I think, across East Asia. Culture of intensive mothering is very important, hard to study with data. I'm going to come back to that one. But housing markets, tax systems, I didn't have time to talk about the Japanese tax system. Educational competition, the feeling that people have that they've got to get their kids into, their one child into Seoul National or whatever, and the cost of education, these are contributing factors. And again, they're more important in some East Asian cases than others. Educational competition, structure of housing market, not very important in Japan anymore. I put in how much do men and women feel that they need each other, because I'm not sure. With the very high rates of non-marriage and, at least according to media reports, very high rates of Japanese in their 40s who've never had a date. You begin to wonder what is really going on between the two sexes. And this is something that, we really need to find out more about. And also recent demographic literature for Europe has really been stressing the role of uncertainty. So not only your own uncertainty about your economic future, but uncertainty about what's happening in the world, and do you want to bring children into the world? So there's a great deal being written about that, and those, I think, are important facets to study in the future.